The first scream cut through the wedding hall just as the violinist lifted his bow, and in that frozen second everyone saw him, the millionaire's son, standing at the altar, his face twisted, his body bent in a way no one expected, and a silence so heavy it felt like guilt settled on every guest at once. If you've ever judged someone in a heartbeat and regretted it later, stay with this story to the very end, and before we go deeper, gently tap like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications, because stories like this change the way we see people forever. No one had warned the guests. The invitations were gold embossed, the venue was a palace of glass and light, and the bride's dress looked like it belonged to a dream. People came expecting perfection, because when a billionaire hosts a wedding, perfection is assumed. But when Daniel Whitmore stepped forward, whispers rippled like a cruel wave. Some guests looked away, others stared too long, a few pretended to check their phones, suddenly fascinated by the floor. Daniel's right shoulder sloped unnaturally, his walk uneven, his face marked by scars that told stories no one wanted to hear at a celebration. The bride's smile trembled, and the groom, Daniel himself, lowered his eyes, already bracing for a lifetime of moments like this. Daniel had grown up rich, but not loved. His father, Charles Whitmore, had built an empire from steel and silence. He believed flaws were failures and weakness was a choice. When Daniel was born with severe physical deformities caused by a medical error, Charles buried his disappointment under money. Doctors, private tutors, luxury homes, everything except warmth. Daniel learned early that people admired his father, envied his wealth, and pitied him. At school he was the broken heir. At home he was a reminder Charles tried to forget. This wedding was meant to be Daniel's victory. He had met Clara when she volunteered at a literacy center, long before she knew who his father was. She loved his humor, his gentleness, the way he listened like every word mattered. When she finally learned the truth, she said, "So you're rich in money too." I was already sold on the rest. Still, standing there in front of hundreds of powerful strangers, Daniel felt 12 years old again, wishing he could disappear. Then, from the far side of the hall, someone else noticed something no one else did. Her name was Ruth. Ruth was the cleaner. A black woman in her late 50s with tired knees and eyes sharpened by decades of watching people when they thought they weren't seen. She had polished these floors since dawn, wiped fingerprints off glass walls, and listened to conversations that floated past like confessions. She had been invisible her whole life, and invisibility, she knew, could be a kind of power. When Ruth saw Daniel's face, she didn't see deformity first. She saw recognition. A small detail tugged at her memory, the pattern of scars, the stiffness in his neck, the way his left hand curled slightly inward. Her heart skipped. She leaned closer, pretending to adjust a floral arrangement, and her breath caught. She had seen this before. Not once. Not twice. Many times. Years ago, Ruth's daughter had worked as a nurse at a private clinic owned, quietly, by Charles Whitmore. Ruth remembered the night her daughter came home shaking, saying, "Mama, they're hiding something. They hurt a baby." And they paid everyone to forget. The next week, the clinic shut down. The doctors vanished. Ruth's daughter died months later in a so-called accident, and Ruth learned what it meant to swallow grief whole. Now, standing in that wedding hall, Ruth realized the baby from that night had grown into the man at the altar. Her hands trembled as she set down her mop. The ceremony stalled. The officiant cleared his throat. Guests shifted. Charles Whitmore watched from the front row, jaw tight, eyes cold. He hated this moment, not because his son was suffering, but because the world was watching. Ruth took a step forward. Security noticed her immediately. A cleaner walking toward the altar was not on the plan. "Ma'am, you can't," a guard whispered harshly. "I need to speak," Ruth said, her voice calm but carrying something heavy. "Because the truth has waited long enough." Laughter flickered among the guests, uneasy and sharp. Charles stood. "Who is this woman?" he demanded. "Remove her." Daniel looked at Ruth then, really looked, and something in her eyes made him raise a hand. "Wait," he said softly. Ruth turned to him. "Son," she said, and the word landed like thunder, "what happened to you is not fate. It was a crime." The room erupted. Charles's face drained of color. Ruth spoke of the clinic. The rushed procedure. The experimental treatment approved to save money and time. The signed documents. The bribes. She told them about her daughter, about the files she had hidden for years, waiting for the right moment because truth, she believed, should be spoken where lies are most comfortable. She reached into her bag and handed a small drive to the officiant. "It's all there," she said. "Medical records, payments, names." Charles tried to laugh it off, but his voice cracked. "This is absurd." But Daniel was already crying, not from shame, but from relief. For the first time in his life, his pain had a name, and it wasn't him. Clara stepped closer, wrapping her arms around Daniel. The guests were no longer whispering. They were listening. Police arrived quietly. Journalists, tipped off by an anonymous email sent an hour earlier, crowded outside. Charles Whitmore was escorted out of his own son's wedding in handcuffs, his empire crumbling in real time.